this is called a presentation of school case presentation, and it doesn't sound sexy, but I promise you a very interesting panel with very different original angles to content, teaching content. It's definitely a series of very interesting presentations that will follow. What we will do, I will introduce one of them. When they come to do the presentation, they will go sit there with the colleagues again, and for the Q&A, the 5 speakers will be up there. So, okay. We first start with Dan Geva from Beit Berel, and he's a documentary filmmaker, made many films, but he has also been looking for what he calls an inspirational ethics approach with his students. Having said this, when I read that he would go with the students in Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, I thought, wow, that is a challenge. Will they not leave his workshop right away? It seems that it has been very joyful and very, very funny what he's doing, and I'm very curious to know more about it. Dan, please take the stage.
Good afternoon to you all, and thank you for this warm introduction. Listen, the first thing that I do when I enter my ethics class is I lie. I look them in the eyes and I say, listen, but I lie in the Kantian sense, you know, it's not the way you think. I tell them a truth, I tell them a big truth, I tell them an absolute truth, but not the whole truth. And this Kant permits, so it's okay. But I tell them, listen, there's no need for you to sit here, right? You don't need to go to university or film school to study ethics. For me, you're first-class ethicists, you're specialists. You've been doing it since day one. If you've arrived thus far, that means that you know what you're doing. By standards of the University of Life, you have your professorship, so just go on, do what you're doing. And some do. As I say, however, and this however concerns all of us, because the grievous problem put on the table here for us is whether ethics can be taught at all. And I do not refer to ethics here in its sense as an academic discipline or as a body of knowledge, right? In which case it would be a trivial fact that content, data, information, and even knowledge qua knowledge can pass from one individual to another, and that it can be perceived in the minds, blah, blah, blah. That's an obvious fact, right? What I would like to attract your attention to is the fact that since antiquity, say in the Hebrew tradition, 10th century BC, the words of Ecclesiastes, passing on to the Greek tradition with the works of Homer, Hesiod, Plato, Aristotle, etc., going on to Nietzsche, and then an extensive body of work done by moral philosophers in the 20th century. Thinkers such as G. Moore, Warnock, Pryor, Ayer, I can count many more, Hare, Stevenson, blah, 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 many more. Philosophers have been and still do raise and establish firm lines of argumentation and rich avenues of thought that fiercely battle and contend the intuitive notion, and perhaps it's a wishful thinking that we all have, that humans make progress in the ethical realm, right? That we better ourselves due to a learning process, ethically speaking, from past experience. That there is such a thing in the objective world called moral advancement, outside our subjectivity. Now, say for the sake of the argument that you oppose this bleak epistemology, that you're a sworn optimist, or just a normative person, just like you and me, right? And you look at the hard evidence around you and you say, hey, look at all this worldly camaraderie, benevolence, care, compassion, generosity, and love that we project on one another. Isn't that strong enough of a sign that we have this inner moral compass and we do make progress? I mean, look at us here. People gathered from all around the world, from many nations and countries. Some of us, our countries are still in conflict, but we're here because we believe that it is vital not only to do good to ourselves, but to others. Isn't that enough of a sign to follow that route of thought? And I think you have to be a miserable cynicist, right? Or a a hypocrite, not to admit that it is. It means a lot. It means a world. It means everything that we've troubled to get here and discuss it. And it is a strong sign of our ethicality and its progress. But still, nonetheless, one would really have to consider the fact and be genuine and be critical enough to admit the fact that we have been dwelling this earth for at least 70,000 years as the most sophisticated linguistic creatures ever to have existed. And still, after all this very long while, we're still compulsively involved in acts of killing, of slaughtering, of murdering, I guess by the hundreds of the millions of both animals and humans, that we inflict horrible pain one upon the other, unnecessary, systematic, horrendous pain. We've seen some evidence, it's just an example, there are many more, that we steal in many more ways than this poor image, that we lie in so many ways, that we not only passively allow injustice, but that we promote it on the personal, national, international, and global level. But perhaps what is more intriguing to our mind is that we have mastered fear and hatred to others and to ourselves to the degree that in a strange way we've allowed our technological sophistication to create weapons that can, at a push of a button, exterminate our own race, which, according to any existing moral philosophy that I know, is an ethical paradox and a moral antinomy, excluding, of course, Armageddon theologies, which I will not discuss here. And I say all of this because I think that when a teacher attempts or enters a class to teach ethics, one cannot but ask oneself, what is it that I'm doing here? Or in the words of Kant, what can I hope for when I make an attempt to teach ethics? In our case, film students, right? And so it is in the view of this, of the discourse's treacherous incommensurability, that I felt that I have to come up with my own way of dealing with the problem. And somewhat awkwardly and somewhat idiosyncratically, I've decided to name the method of my teaching and learning ethics, inspirational ethics. But before I further delve into the fundamentals and the details of this framework of teaching and learning, let me briefly introduce to you the near semantic field of this intriguing word, inspiration, because it means many things, among which is to actuate, it means to animate, it means to blow into, and it means to breathe upon. And it means also to infuse. And all of that is by some sort of mental or spiritual influence. All right? And I got my own idea to use the word and the concept of inspiration as a foundation for my work from this German psychologist, Wolfgang Kohler, I hope I pronounced his name right, and his work on insight learning. Kohler, something like that. I think I'm pretty close to the truth. Let us follow his model. Bear with me. It seems a little bit complicated, but it's not. It's very simple. For him, inspiration means identification. Think about it. And identification is the base structure of our own identity. Without identity, we do not exist as humans. And identity allows what humans do, and probably only humans do that, self-recognition. But what humans do more than that is they do self-questioning, right? We go to Descartes, the father of modern philosophy. The first notion is that we self-question our own being. But that is allowed and permitted only through the linguistic tool of the metaphor. And it is through the metaphor that a miracle happens. He calls it the aha-erlebnis, aha moment. Right? What is aha moment? Is that when we all of a sudden realize something anew, we are awakened to our own self-awareness in a way we weren't before. It's like, I realized something I was not aware to before. And for him, this aha moment of spiritual and mental awakening is no other than creativity. So if you simplify this model, you see how simple it is. It means that inspiration means creativity. This for me served as my own aha-erlebnis, in the sense that I realized that if you want to teach ethics, you have to find the foundations to link inspiration with creativity, logically speaking. So you can think here on of my framework of inspirational ethics in terms of an attempt to reconcile between two existential impulses. On the one hand, is that we all have a moment in life in which we are robbed away or robbed from our naivete. You know what I'm talking about, right? We have our automatic or natural belief in something, but at a certain point in our life, we realize it's different. At the basic and most simple and accepted things, no. It's not like we thought about it. And then you start to contemplate. At the same time, being inspired is essential. Essential meaning you cannot do without it. Right? It's not a matter of choice. It's essential to the formation of our subjectivity and creativity. Okay? So with these two existential impulses in mind, you can start to think of what I'll soon introduce to you, inspirational ethics, as an approach to ethics. And it's all designed to one purpose, and that is to quicken the heart. Quicken the heart of the student to pursue sound moral reasoning. And it has to be inspired by the thought and the work and the teaching of the great masters of ethics. It cannot come solely from your bare intuition. So the process of learning consists of 3 phases. The first phase is perhaps the most critical. I tell them, listen, before we do any learning, before I pass any information to you, write down a 1-page testimony about a moment of an ethical awakening that has to do with your filmic universe. No instructions. Just try to be as descriptive as you can. And they come up with beautiful stories. Okay, and I take these and I put them aside. I hold them. And then we devote some time, a good portion, and to a learning process. And I tell them this: let yourself be truly inspired by the magnificence of 3 systems of ethical thought which I will introduce to you. This is my responsibility, just to introduce to you these systems of thought. And then I tell them, now it's back to you. You have to commission yourself to a genuine ethical working process. Again, based on sound reasoning. Sound reasoning is not something that I invented. Aristotle started it, so it's him to blame. But you'll see what it means. But before we do that, one has to really have a clear view of the field of ethics as we know it, because it consists of 3 giant rivers of giant traditions. One of them is meta-ethics, the other one is applied ethics, and the other one is normative ethics. And my inspirational ethics, in many senses, try to battle with it and just shake these foundations and say, no, we got to go in another way. And so meta-ethics I think you have a notion of it. Simply speaking, it is a 20th century definition to ancient problems in moral philosophy. Nothing new in it. Questions like, what is the nature of the good? No concrete answer to that, but it's a question. Is there moral substance in the real world, or is it all in our head? Big problem. But it's all abstract, absolute abstract, and philosophers would kill one another in their battle about what is the answers to these questions. Too abstract. Applied ethics is the response to this over-abstractedness. Applied ethics is really a philosophical examination of particular issues, right? Of do's and don't do's, rules and regulations, blah, blah. We know all that. There's a yes, should I not? And it just applies a proper, if you may, professional conduct or just a code, ethical code. We know that. So it is designed to answer should, yes, no. Very simple. And indeed, when students come up with examples for the moment of ethical awakening, and they're not distinct in that sense. We all do. When we think about ethics, we think of particular issues. You know, what should I do? Should I tell my friend that her haircut is ugly? I mean, should I be truthful that her dress is awful? So forth, you know what I'm saying? So students come up with problems like, is it right at all to invade one's privacy with a camera? Big question. But the answer is, of course, according to applied ethics, yes, no, do, don't, and then you reconcile it. Or should I film a person doing a bad deed? That's a big question. Or can I film third world poor people without feeling guilty? That's a big issue. But it's all yes, no, and it's all practical, almost too practical. Because someone will tell you, bottom line, someone will tell you what's right to do. It's not you, all right? So applied ethics cannot have survived without this guy, this realm, normative ethics. Because normative ethics is really the fire that engines what applied ethics do. It's the field of study that aims to determine the principles. And there cannot be a yes-no in the applied realm without determining the principles by which actions are considered right? And character. And in the field of normative ethics, the theories that deal with the principle, that is when it begins to be interesting. Many theories, abundance of theories that were constructed in the course of the past 3,000 years, from which I chose three as my protagonists: Aristotle, Kant, and Mill. Good friends. They'll never betray you. And the reason that I chose them is that each and every one of them is responsible to one of the three most influential system of thought in the history of moral philosophy. Aristotle is responsible for the theory of the virtue theory. Kant is responsible for deontology, theory of the duty, and Mill is responsible for utilitarianism. But not only the principle and the title is different. What is different is the point of origin of their inquiry, of their moral inquiry. That is even more important. Because Aristotle believes that you have to start with a research of the human soul. It's what it's all about, the human soul. And he devotes a great portion of his work to ask, how does our soul function and how should it function properly? Kant, on the other hand, believes in reason and the rule of reason and in the place it serves as the ruler of duty. It is our duty to obey to our reason, right? We'll get to that a bit later. And Mill, he thinks pleasure is a principle. But I'll explain that. It's not the kind of pleasure that you think, or we tend to think. He's not that nice. Now, I devote anywhere between, it depends on the class, and there anywhere between 3 to 6 classes to this portion, Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, anywhere between 1 to 2 classes to an introduction, a friendly introduction, an intimate introduction of these three lads, these three heroes. They are protagonists. So Aristotle asks a very plain question. He just asks, What does it take for an individual human being to be a good person? That is a very simple and basic question, right? We ask that all the time. And for him, the answer is also pretty simple. He said it is about finding the balance between excess and deficiency. But what's on the stake is the arete, the moral virtue. But it's not just any moral virtue. It's the moral virtue at its best. It is about excellence. We have to be excellent with regard to our moral virtues. And he counts 13. Let's count them. Courage, temperance, magnificence, right ambition, liberality, sincerity, generosity, friendly civility, good temper, modesty, wittiness, just resentment. Each of them has its own point of excess and deficiency. If you are a good person, it means that you have pursued these 13 virtues and you follow them and you reach eudaimonia. That is a complete, fulfilled life lived in accordance with reason. But it is a life project. Kant, on the other hand, believes in the categorical imperative. It means that in the realm of ethics, we're talking about absolute necessity. There's no choice here. And the only thing that is good without qualification is goodwill. Without goodwill, we were not here today, and nothing would. And that's the only thing that counts. Not what you do and not what comes out of it, but whether you did it out of goodwill. Interesting. He phrases the categorical imperative by 3 forms. You can get an image and get to the groundwork, the metaphysics of morals, and read it yourself. 3 brilliant ways of phrasing what a categorical imperative means. I'll pass on to Mill because he speaks about pleasure, but it's not the pleasure that you think. It is a pleasure that is more pleasure to the intellect, to the feelings, imagination, and moral sentiments. He's an existentialist, and for him, the best human life is one in which higher faculties, right, play an adequate part. So it's not about the pleasure of the flesh. It's about the pleasure of the mind. And this is when we become ethical. We follow. So after we devote 3 to 6 classes to get intimate with these 3 people, great people, I tell them, let yourself be truly inspired by them. You know, these are true friends. They will always wait for you, and they will always give you an answer. And you have to find your own way of deciding whether you're an absolute Aristotelian. Are you a Kantian by nature? Would you like to live the Mill way and consider the outcome as the principle? Or would you like to navigate and consider sound reasoning? I invite you to calibrate your own reasoning through these 3 giants. And basically it's a 3-phase process. First is think again. Now I pull out the testimonies. I say, go back to your own testimony and look at it again and stop and think about the nature of your moment of ethical awakening. Now that you have these 3 friends in your mind, think about them again. And the second phase is check. Check possible ways of reasoning with your own moment of awakening. What were you considering? What were you debating? What were you afraid of? What did you then think it's ethical or not? So think about it again through them. You're not alone anymore. And the third is a go. A go because, listen, you're out there in the world by your own. So it's a calling to evaluate your ethical attitude with respect to what Kant says. How would you like the world in which you take part of be? So you have to think about what would you like to hope this world can be, not what it is now. So inspirational ethics is a method intended to make moral thinking into a desirable area of self-growth, right? Rather than a restrictive, authoritative sphere or realm of abstract knowledge. So we have 3 options. You either follow the self-fulfillment track, you either go by the goodwill as duty, or either go by the highest pleasure. They're both very tempting. But I think that what is more important for us here is that I think that this framework allows us to initiate a program where we would all collect testimonies from our students. We can film them very simply. It's a 2-3 minute testimony. And think of, let's say, the Select site or any website that we upload hundreds of testimonies about film students that debate about their own ethical being. And then we can develop that to where we reevaluate and involve sound reasoning about it. And that could be kind of a database or a starting point to reconsider what ethics mean to us. Thank you very much.
Okay. Are there any questions, please? There's a question over there.
Well, before a question, I first want to offer an appreciation. This was spectacular. And I
Who are
thank...
you, sir? Can you introduce quickly?
I am Michael Renov from the University of Southern California.
Okay.
So thank you, all of you. Very mind-opening. My question really is for Dan, and I so much appreciated what you had to say in how you teach ethics. But I have a question, since you introduce your students to the three friends you mentioned, to Aristotle, Kant, and Mill. How do you get to know those friends if you don't read them? How do you have time to have people actually read primary texts, or do you?
If, say, you take 2 classes to each and you read together the most important segments, I was surprised at how much you can achieve. And then my idea is always to give incentives to the students to do more reading, but I'm very humble about it. I know that students nowadays don't read the whole text, but the nice thing about Aristotle, Kant, and Mill, that they wrote tiny books about ethics. The book, the book of virtue, and then Kant's more philosophy, and then Mill's utilitarianism. These are small books, really, very modest. And there's something very appealing to students when you present to them these 3 little books, little in size. It's like soliciting them. Come on, I mean, they're very little. Put them in the pocket. My idea is, you know, you should be able to read something you can put in the pocket. And I have these editions and I demonstrate. And I always tell my students, you don't have to read the whole text. This is my philosophy with regard to it. Look into the book and find one paragraph that will go along with you for the rest of your life. I think I've done my job by this. You know what I'm saying? It's like, you got to be humble about it. And let then the theoreticians or the professional scholars to read the entire text. But it's enough of a mission to peep in and find one paragraph that really, really ignites your imagination. So with that in mind, I achieve my goal. So it's a modest target that can be realistically achieved.
Is that an answer for you?
Philosophy as poetry.
Pardon me?
Philosophy as poetry.
As poetry.
Yes.